Warm greetings, dear ones, and welcome to Unity Church. Welcome to this time that we set aside for worship each week to help us find and keep our balance, to think about those things that matter most, to root out racism in ourselves and in the world, and to align our lives to integrity, service, and joy. This morning, it is a great joy to welcome the Reverend Karen Hutt, who is joining us as our preacher today. Karen Hutt is the adjunct minister at First Universalist Church across the river. She is also vice president for student formation and vocation and innovation at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. And she will be preaching the GA Sunday worship service on Sunday, June 27th, with the Reverend Jen Crow, also from First Universalist. And so we will be joining you for worship again in 2 weeks, because we will be joining that worship service streaming on that Sunday. So look forward to hearing Karen twice this month. Thank you for joining us today. As we reach out from the sanctuary here, we too miss being together in person. Despite the limitations, we hope you will enter in as fully as you can. Light a chalice, speak, and sing along. Call out the names of those in need. Let worship have its way with you until we are together again. After the service, whether this is your first time with us or you've been here your whole life, you're invited to participate in a virtual Zoom coffee hour where we share a bit of our lives with each other and get to know one another more deeply. If you would like to learn more about Unity Church and Unitarian Universalism, we invite you to participate in Finding Yourself at Unity today at 1 p.m. This week's 1-hour online class will offer information about Unity's religious education programming for children, youth, and adults. This week at Wellspring Wednesday, the Reverend K.P. Hong and I invite you to join us on Zoom for a conversation about the what, how, and why of spiritual practices. After the conversation, participants will be invited to join a breakout session on one of 4 practices that will be featured in monthly small group offerings in July and August. Learn about how reading, writing, conversation, and reflection can become spiritual practices, and consider which of these might feed the hunger of your soul. Have you felt a pull into deeper service to the congregation or know someone who is? If so, Unity's trustees invite you to consider serving or nominating someone to serve on the board. Trustees are essential to envisioning Unity's future and holding the congregation accountable to our stated ends. We welcome you to learn more about this opportunity by attending a Zoom information session this month or by submitting an application or nomination form by July 1st. Details about all of the offerings shared this morning are available on our homepage. Next Sunday, during a service entitled Until Father Gets Home, worship leaders Mike Huber and Brian Newhouse will explore the role of fathers as protectors and providers, and how we are shaped by those who play these roles and those who didn't or couldn't in our own lives. And once again, welcome to Unity Church. It is a joy to share this time together.
Good morning. Grieving is right and proper. Grieving in part may honor those who have left, but mainly serves those who remain. There's no shame in it. I wanted to come and say this morning because of a story I'll share about my family. When I was growing up, I always got the sense that my father's side of the family would never consider holding a funeral or a memorial service. Once you punched your ticket, so to speak, that was that. Everything else was superstition, or privately, maybe weakness. When my father died 3 years ago, many of the arrangements fell to me and to two of my siblings. We did hold a small memorial service, but that side of my family remained steadfast in their conviction. I feel like to honor a departure, any sort of departure, has so much value. It's an opportunity not only to process grief, but also to think about forgiveness, about affection, about intention, about change, and about memory. Come, let us worship together. Will you join us in singing "Abide with Me"? Friends, will you join us in a responsive reading? Friend, I have lost the way.
The way leads on.
Is there another way?
The way is one.
I must retrace the track.
It's lost and gone.
Back. I must travel back.
None goes there. None.
Then I'll make here my place.
The road runs on.
Stand still and set my face.
The road leaps on.
Stay here, forever stay.
None stays here. None.
I cannot find the way.
The way leads on.
Oh, the places I have passed.
The journey is done.
And what will come at last?
The way leads on.
And now please join us in a moment of silence.
Each time we gather for worship, we set aside a moment to expand the caring ministry of this congregation. Together, we recognize the cycle of life and death, the circle of love, compassion, and witness that is at the center of this and every sacred community. We stand at the side of parents and teachers and all those whose primary spiritual practice is caring for children, with those who live with grief or chronic pain, with illnesses seen and unseen, with mental disability or addiction. We pray for our neighbors in prison, for those who care for family members in ill health, and those who are struggling to stay afloat in the midst of poverty. Our lives are blessed by those who knowingly and with curiosity and courage face their final days, and by those who rise above heartbreak to challenge oppression in all its forms. We pray for those in harm's way, for the wisdom and strength of the leaders of the world, and for the people of this courageous congregation, as together we live into the longing to embody and help to build the beloved community. And will you pray with me now for these we name? As our ministers emeritus and emerita, Rob and Jan Eller Isaacs, leave St. Paul this week for their new home out west, we send them our deep gratitude and continuing love and wish them every blessing in their new adventures, ministries, and life journeys. We send support and healing care to Dawn Baker and Aaron Milgram as Aaron begins treatment this week for a new cancer diagnosis. We also hold in our thoughts and prayers Michelle Macy's brother, Justin Lapierre, who underwent heart surgery last week in Mexico, where he lives. Challenges during the procedure required the surgical team to place him in a temporary medically induced coma. We offer love and support to Michelle and her wider family as they await his wakening and recovery. We hold Barb Foss and her cousin's husband, Joe Hruska, in prayer and love as he recovers from a cardiac-caused coma. He was airlifted from Upper Michigan to Green Bay, Wisconsin on Friday for care, and his heart is now stable, but his prognosis is unclear. We extend our sympathies to Barry Reich, whose nephew, Michael Chvestuik, died suddenly of a heart attack on June 4th at the age of 53. His family will miss his gregarious spirit. And we hold in our caring embrace the family and friends grieving the drowning death this last week of 12-year-old Ashok Prowden. Unity member Miranda Bryan and her colleagues at the Greater Twin Cities Youth Symphonies cherished Ashok as an orchestra member and radiant youth in their musical family, and they now mourn his death. Lastly, we acknowledge all the currents of grief that flow around the world as lives are compromised and lost to both COVID-19 and systemic racism. As more and more of us are able to remove our masks, may we be emboldened to let our faces and our lives express our concern for one another and our commitment to do our part for the well-being of all. May we stand in compassionate solidarity with our neighbors here at home and all around the world. May they and may we be instruments of a just and lasting peace. I now invite you to speak aloud or hold in the silent sanctuary of your hearts the names of those you would like to lift today in worship. The Reverend Karen Hutt will now lead us in prayer.
Friends, take your hands and make a circle of prayer, or create a visual circle in your mind, or a circle in your breath, and consume the unity and the eternity, the totality of that circle. It has no beginning and it has no end. It is adaptable, flexible, pure, even culturally neutral. This circle is a lot like us and our prayers. It has the capacity to be dialed, rotated, notched, spun, sliced, and subdivided. It represents the image of the cosmos, the circles of the seasons, human life itself, and the orbits of the planets around the sun. In astronomy, the circle indicates a full moon. In meteorology, a clear sky. In alchemy, it's the symbol for chemical change. In cartography, the circle represents a village, a town, a people, a community. The circle is also nothing, zero, but the circle has potential. It is an embryo. Think about your family in prayer today. Think about your family, your community, your country, our world as a circle. Perhaps God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Perhaps the circle is the warmth of that mysterious thing we call grace. Yet human circles, friends, can also restrict entrance and make escaping them difficult. Circles can confine what is within and keep things out. Circles can imprison us. But friends, right now, let your prayerful spiritual circle, let your human circle, let your Unitarian Universalist circle tug at you today. Let your circles give you both comfort and uneasiness. For in the nuance of these circles, you will know your truth. Know that this community can hold your truths. We can hold your truths in prayer. We can hold your truths in these pews. We can hold your truths at home. Your incongruities, your frailty, your addiction, your recovery, your fear, your pain, and your joy. Know that we are the container for your prayers that can hold your laments for justice, your cries for peace, and your anger for fairness. Engage that circle as we hold each other's joys and concerns. And now let us sing together.
A special welcome to the children and to the families who are joining for this worship service. And there's a smile on my face as I see families signing up that I might run into you outside in the church garden. As we do, I want to invite the children, as you can at home, wherever you are, come a little closer to the screen for this story for all ages. Some time ago, the poet Robert Bly asked, "What is sorrow for? And how long does it take to climb into grief? Is it 1 year? Is it 50 years? What is sorrow for?" In southeastern Europe, in a region known as the Balkan Peninsula, there is a beautiful and ancient city called Sarajevo. It is a city that was established by a Turkish sultan long, long ago in 1462. And since it was established, it is one of only a few major European cities where there is a mosque, a synagogue, a Catholic church, an Orthodox church, all in the same neighborhood, like in Jerusalem. So Sarajevo is sometimes called the Jerusalem of Europe, with Muslims and Jews, Catholics and Orthodox Christians living side by side for centuries. But from 1992 to 1996, Sarajevo became a terrible war zone in the Bosnian War. Bombs and bullets fell from the sky like rain, and there was constant lack of food and water and electricity, and so much suffering, so many lives lost in that terrible war. But it was on May the 27th, 1992, in the very beginning months of the Bosnian War, that an artillery shell fell on a street in front of a bakery where people had been lining up just to buy bread for that day. There were 22 people who lost their lives in that bombing, and countless others who were injured. And the whole city of Sarajevo felt the pain and the heartache and the grief. The very next day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Vedran Smilovic, the principal cellist of Sarajevo's opera house, he put on his formal white shirt and black coattail, and he brought with him a chair and his cello to that cobblestone street in front of the bakery that was now in ruins. And he climbed into the rubble, and he sat down his chair, and he started to play his cello. He remembers at first not even knowing what to play. His face with tears streaming down as his heart searched for a way to find a way through his own grief and heartache. But as he started to play his cello, his mind recognized the music that his heart was reaching for. It was Tommaso Albinoni's Adagio. And the Adagio soared through the battered ruins of Sarajevo, touching people's hearts, asking them to stop, to listen, and to weep. He came to that spot in the square for 22 consecutive days. Each day and each playing of the adagio to honor each of the 22 friends and neighbors who had been killed. And each day, despite the risk of constant sniper fire, the people stopped and they gathered and they wept. And at the sight of the bombing that had killed those 22 people and created such violence, the people wept and they began to see that no one was alone in their weeping and in their mourning. And they began to see into each other's heart and to touch the pain and the loss, the heartbreak that everyone held. And if they could look into each other's heart, they saw that in the very sight of the ruin and rubble was a possibility that a revolution of love could arise. The people saw in the very sight of such mourning and violence that there could be music, that there could be courage. Courage strong enough to embrace the sorrow of Sarajevo and even the sorrow of the whole world grieving with the people of Sarajevo. And as they mourned together, that they could even touch the beginnings of hope, of a dream, that one day music would be played in cities of peace and harmony everywhere. Cities of peace that would know war no more. May it be so, and amen.
Thank you, KP, for the story today and always. Your support of the church is an expression of the promises we make to each other and to the world. Though the future is unclear, we can't let fear undermine the strength of the ministry we share. Please do your best to be generous with the church today so that the church in turn can maintain our programs, our staff, and keep our promises to the many community partners that our Sunday offerings support. Today, the larger portion of our offering will be shared with Habitat for Humanity. We have partnered with Habitat for the past 10 years or more, helping to build houses in St. Paul under the umbrella name of Faith Builders. Our volunteers staff 2 weeks of construction in the St. Paul area. This offering will continue to fund this shared work, and if COVID interrupts that work this summer, the offering will be shared with another fund of Habitat's called the At Home Fund, which is dedicated to assisting Habitat's homeowners who are struggling to make their mortgage payments due to COVID-19. I hope you will join me in being generous with your offering today. During the interlude, please visit Unity's homepage or follow the link in the YouTube information to make your contribution. There you can also nominate a partner for a future offering. And you can also mail in a check for your offering today or click on your Shelby app and make a donation that way. Thank you for your generosity.
How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. Her foes have become the head, her enemies prosper, because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe.
Good morning. About a month ago, we had our weekly staff meeting at First Universalist, and the Karen that usually likes to joke around, the Karen that likes to make up names for other staff people, and the Karen who's always connecting the dots, the Karen that's appropriately optimistic, didn't show up. The Karen that likes to make irreverent commentary didn't come to that staff meeting. The Karen that came to that staff meeting had been holding on to something. So during check-in, that something that I was holding on to burst forth unexpectedly. Someone I know in another setting in my life made a racial joke that hurt my feelings the week prior. It hurt my heart. It froze my body and stunned me into complete silence when it happened. Not one utterance did I make to that comment. The usual, and that was really unusual for me, really, because I usually respond to things like that, but something else had happened. I usually have a laundry list of comebacks for white people who make racialized commentary to me. Comebacks for the well-intentioned liberal, comebacks for the Trumpsters, and comebacks for the misguided progressives. But not today. Instead, a melody of grief was released, and I cried. I cried a poem of loss. I cried a litany for my dismissed humanity. This was a lament. This was what many of us call an ugly cry. Friends, for some of us, all we may know about the word lament is from the Bible. That amazing book of Lamentations we heard the first 5 verses from, written by the amazing prophet Jeremiah in the Hebrew Scriptures. But the poetry of lamentation and its associated descriptors is found in all oral literature, in all languages and all cultures. Across the entire globe, we lament. It can be found in Yoruba, in Sanskrit, in Hindi. Laments are the face of our humanity. Yes, it is mourning, friends, but not always about death. Mourning not for a purpose, but an existential wail as primal as a child's need to cry. Throughout human history, from the Australopithecines who lost babies in childbirth in the Rift Valley, to the children who watched their fathers being shot by the police in the back seats of cars, lament is a way of bearing the unbearable. A human need to say no, to say why, to say help. Laments tell the truth of the suffering that is smothering our worthiness, stomping on our dreams, and our ability to work towards a better day. Naming those horrors in an unrestrained lament helps mold us into a people who respond with an empathic no to the ways that our nation and our communities are turned into graven images of hatred and despair, which we see too often these days. The loss of lament in Western culture, though, friends, is lamentable. I believe that one of the reasons we have trouble lamenting in this country is the imprint of Christian theology on our secular culture. Think about it, friends. It's not fashionable for people to feel and show emotions. How often do we see people apologize, particularly here in Minnesota? People apologize when they start to cry, even though they have suffered a great loss, and this is a moral and natural reaction. We have come to think of such powerful expressions of grief as ugly, and therefore seek to avoid them, to avoid even seeing them, talking about them, much less grieving like this ourselves. Eventually, though, idealism about what one is facing when it doesn't match up with reality will give way to a certain kind of weariness, trauma, more grief, and suffering. There's nothing to be ashamed out concerning sorrow, misery, grief, and lamentation. Many of us are UUs because we're dissatisfied with traditional Christian and perhaps Jewish responses that did not serve those caught up in the grip of suffering. You dissociated yourselves from these doctrinal constructs that don't correspond with people's real-life experiences. This theodicy problem has long been recognized as a dilemma in Christian theology, and especially after the Shoah in Jewish theology. God's authority is asserted with words like omnipotent, omnipresent, all-powerful. This thinking asserts that if something goes wrong, terribly wrong, horribly wrong, it must be the fault of the sufferer. So does the all-good God, allowing suffering for whatever reason as a punishment for sin? Does God do that suffering to punish us for sin, as a test of our faith, as a means of saving others, to import some moral lesson? This thinking trivializes and justifies the victim's suffering, which causes even more harm than aid. But friends, do not get too comfortable shaking your finger and shaking your heads at Jewish and Christian traditions. The same problem exists with our secular liberal democracy. Starting with the Declaration of Independence, the words do not match up with reality. So does the all-good, all-powerful, all-equalizing construct of democracy allow suffering for whatever reason as a punishment? A punishment perhaps for being native, a punishment perhaps for being black, as a test of our patriotism, as a means of saving whiteness, to impart some moral lesson? This thinking also trivializes and justifies the victim's suffering, which causes more harm than aid. If people are to move from purely passive endurance of suffering to suffering that can humanize them in a productive way, then one of the things they need is a language that is honest, relevant, and truthful. Now, 1,000 years ago, women from Hunan province in central China were denied literacy. These women were suffering and imprisoned by feet being bound to the size of 3 inches when they were reached the age of 7. They fought back and took revenge by inventing a secret written language, incomprehensible to men, called Nushu. This female language of lament, now on the verge of extinction, was only recently discovered. Having been confined to one place all their lives, these Chinese women felt a desperate need for a language in which to protest and bewail their situation in support of each other. Today, the access to this language is in the form of ancient tradition has recently been documented and published. This literature was a way for these women to bear the unbearable through a self-defined language of lament. In this community, lament was both communal for them and private. It spoke of political, social, and religious voices. It called on spiritual entities and higher powers to be accountable, and at the same time, it called upon them for aid and relief. It accuses and it praises. It is deeply spiritual as well as subversive and political. Lamentation is the spiritual practice, a spiritual discipline. It is about release, about letting the painful emotions flow, letting fear fly free, letting doubt invade your thoughts, letting bewilderment puzzle you, letting anger absorb you, and letting shame and guilt shatter you, and most of all, let sadness in. Friends, let it in. Resisting difficult emotion is often our default defense. It's not easy to endure those feelings, let alone welcome them. It's hard to allow ourselves to feel hurt. I know I didn't like that feeling and not doing a darn thing about it, but I limited my understanding when I didn't embrace it. We limit our understanding and acceptance of suffering when we don't let lament in. When we lament, we eventually start to assimilate our losses and assimilate it into our spirit and embody that awful pain with self-compassion and right actions. The crying out of the soul creates a pathway between the already and the not yet. Between the already and the not yet. Lament minds the gap between the current hopelessness and the coming possibilities. Lament anticipates a new creation, but also acknowledges the painful reality of now. Now, before we step out with determination to fight for justice or an emotional equilibrium in the painful reality that is now in America, before we do that, we must allow and create space for our pain and fears. For it's in these places we find a weird ability to bear the unbearable. When we let lament flow its natural course, we ready ourselves and engage with life anew to move forward. Now, without that, without lamentation, without emotional healing, advancing towards resolution, this cannot happen, in which only misery and pain and misguided behavior can persist. I've been in a lot of UU churches for 25, 30 years. UUs often avoid lamenting. The absence of lament in our liturgy and in our churches results in a loss of memory. We forget the reality of suffering and pain and go too quickly to indignation and moral outrage. We are in a time of global lament, friends, with a pandemic, climate change, displaced people, wars, exile, abuse, fear, poverty, uprising and downplaying, hatred, depression, anxiety, and disinformation. Stop for a pause. Stop. We cannot approach these concerns with just our long-held values and pristine beliefs on paper. We cannot approach these challenges with just principles and purposes. Any theological reflection that observes the suffering of the have-nots, those people, my neighbors, that results in you calling Black people to see how they are doing after another visual assault that they see on their televisions of a degraded humanity being plastered across their media inputs. Don't call me to ask me how I'm doing. That's a phone call you need not make when George Floyd is killed to me. Your call to me minimizes the onslaught of being hunted like an animal instead of lamenting with me. The triumphalism of the haves that place BLM stickers on their Facebook page is too neat and tidy for the power of my cries. Lament with me. Lament with me. Lamenting is risky speech. Or as the Protestant theologian Walter Brueggemann said, lamenting is dangerous, restless speech. Lamenting is dangerous, restless speech. Friends, when our tears become ideas and our emotions become political, lamentation can become as dangerous, powerful, provocative tool because it challenges power structures. It calls for justice. It pushes the boundaries of our relationships with each other, and our spirits are no longer limited. Because lamentation refused to settle for the status quo. It is reminding us of the powers that be, and that there are human situations that are unacceptable and that we must act. Laments are irreversible when spoken. It is done and cannot be recalled. It takes risks because one never knows until the act of lamenting is done whether one has gone too far or not. Friends, to live without lament is to live an unexamined life. Sometimes our laments will be impolite. Sometimes they will be raw. Sometimes they will be bitter. Even if we express sorrow or verbalize anger, even if we make demands, we are actually preaching to the world that it is possible to have a pain so deep while being fearless and faithful to transformation. Lamentation is a revolutionary act, one that our faith needs to reclaim and reframe as we do to create the world again anew. Lament on, my brothers and sisters, my siblings, my friends. Do not be afraid to cry. Why? Blessed be and amen. And now we will sing together. in your life, may you know the holy meaning and the mystery that breaks into every moment. May you live at peace with your world and at peace with yourself. And may the love of truth guide you in your everyday activities. No matter how weak or how frightened we may feel, we each have gifts that can make a difference in the world. So friends, in the coming weeks, do at least one thing to support the broken, to welcome the stranger, to celebrate what is worthy, and do the work of justice and love. Be connected and take action so you may be a little more whole. Blessed be, Amen and Ashe.